Okay. Hello everyone, and welcome to the launch of Protector by Dr. Chandra Muzaffar. We are going to start at 8:30 sharp, so just wait perhaps a couple of minutes, so that everyone who was planning to join us today can make it. So. Okay, and as it turns out, it is 8:30, so we can now begin. All right. So on behalf of Drug Vidaya, thank you everyone for joining us this Wednesday evening. We have had the honor of being able to republish a new edition of Dr. Chandra Muzaffar's Protector. This book has been it really is a modern classic, and it has and even in the decades that have gone past, it still retains its power. So I'll just quickly introduce Professor Chandra, who is currently president of the International Movement for a Just World. He was previously the first director of the Center for Civilizational Dialogue at the University of Malaya, and later the Nordin Supi Professor of Global Studies at the University of Science in Penang. He was also the founder president of Aliran Kesedaran Negara, a post which he held from 1977 to 1991. And our moderator for this evening is Dr. Khaldun Malik, who is very kindly agreed to join Dr. Chandra for this discussion. He's Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Ethnic Studies at University Kebangsaan Malaysia. The format of today's conversation is intended to be relatively casual. So what will be happening for the first half an hour or so will be a conversation between Dr. Khaldun and Dr. Chandra. This will be a fairly casual conversation for all of you who are watching. But along the way, I expect that we will be able to touch upon various themes of interest. So without further ado, I'll just be quietly in a corner, and I shall leave the events up to the both of you. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, William. It's a very kind introduction. And hello, Professor. How are you? Good, excellent. No, I'd like to begin, if I may, by asking a very basic question. As perhaps some of the listeners may not be aware of, when Protector first came out, it was perhaps one of the most original attempts to understand Malay political culture, to theorize about Malay political culture, which had not been done much from the period, but it's not being done today. So it was a very significant contribution to our understanding of Malay political culture from a historical point of view. So perhaps my question to Dr. Chandra would be, why did you choose to focus on the question of, and pardon for me repeating the same thing, unquestioning loyalty?
Thank you, Khaldun, and nice to meet you visually, William, and it's good the three of us here, together in this conversation. To respond to Khaldun, the theme of this book, Unquestioning Loyalty, Leadership, is actually part of my PhD thesis. In my PhD thesis, submitted in 1977 to the University of Singapore, I had looked at dominant and dissenting ideas in Malay society, from the Malacca period right up to the present, the 70s. And for me, one of the most significant of the dominant theme in Malay political culture was unquestioning loyalty to the leader. And I sought to try to understand this phenomenon because I saw it as something which was a major force in shaping contemporary politics in Malay, this notion of unquestioning loyalty. So that's the reason why a book was published. It's a portion of my thesis, actually. And Protector came out in 1979. It went into 2 prints, 3 prints altogether. And there was a Bahasa translation some 8 years later called Lindung. Lindung, just a single print, you know. So this idea of unquestioning loyalty, and others have written about it, and I think some others have explored the theme in greater depth. It's been part of our conversation, if you like, except that because it is not linked to the dominant power structure, you find that not many people want to debate and discuss this. But it is there. It's part of the environment.
It's interesting that we speak about dominant power structures, Prof. And in a sense, it can be a bit of a very big idea to understand easily. So when you talk about unquestioning loyalty, what do you mean by unquestioning loyalty? Because I suppose allegiance and loyalty is very much part and parcel of any power structure in different parts of the world. So what distinguishes, what features distinguishes what you're trying to describe in your understanding of unquestioning loyalty within the Malay context?
This is a good question. It's true that this exchange between the ruler and the ruled is not uncommon. You pledge allegiance, in return, you are protected. And it just happened right through history. It's as current as anything that we are familiar with in the present environment. So it's something which has been there, but I think there are 2 elements in unquestioning loyalty within Malay political culture that we should be aware of. Number 1, if unquestioning loyalty is part of Malay political culture, it presents a problem because that same political culture, which is related to Islam, that same political culture has a notion of leader-led relationship that is quite different. In other words, there is a clear contradiction, which is why, if you look at the book which Budaya has republished, it opens with a quote from the first caliph in Islam, Sayyidina Abu Bakr. And in that quote, which is very simple, a translation of that quote in English, it says that unquestioning loyalty to leadership is something which is not encouraged. That I'm paraphrasing the whole thing, that it is basically a questioning relationship that Islam encourages. Allegiance to a ruler in Islam, said the Caliph, is actually telling the truth to the ruler. Concealing the truth from the ruler is actually treason. Now, if you reflect on that, it's the direct opposite of what feudal societies had cultivated everywhere. including Malay society. This notion of concealing the truth very often in order to preserve that relationship. But in Islam, you have to tell the truth. So this notion of telling truth to power is something that is deeply rooted in Islam. Though students of politics don't really recognize this, they think it is something that came from the West, not realizing that there was this notion of telling the truth to power. So I think that's a very important factor that should be kept in mind when we talk about Malay political culture in relation to this particular dimension of Malay political culture. And we should also remember, and you can see this from the book, that what becomes a problem is being unquestioningly loyal when injustices. All the examples I give from traditional Malay society are related to injustices, wrongdoings, killing a person without due process, kidnapping someone's wife, sort of doing other things which were clearly against Islamic values and against the ethics in almost every culture and civilization. So it is unquestioning loyalty in that context which is a problem. And if it is carried into the present, it becomes a challenge to not just the ethical framework that we're talking about. It is also a challenge to the whole notion of democratic governance. If you are somehow required to accept authority, regardless of whether the exercise of that authority or the exercise of power was justified or not. So that's the reason why I thought that this phenomenon is something that one had to explore, because as a student of politics, I began to see how often this had expressed itself in the contemporary world, in contemporary Malay society. I mean, I look at what had happened to certain political leaders, the way in which people were just telling the truth were silenced, marginalized, expelled from the mainstream. I could see that there was a phenomenon at work. And what was amazing was that a lot of people, including people who were capable of thinking, accepted all this without wanting to question.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra. It's interesting that you speak about this concept and you reiterate it in a way to allow us to understand how you're using it in the context of your book. And in your book, you covered a very large historical span of time, ranging from the Malaccan period all the way to more contemporary, to the present, so to speak. And also in between, you straddle the colonial period. Now, when you look at the question of, say, the way in which loyalty was enunciated and articulated, say, during the Malaccan period or in the pre-colonial period, did it remain the same? Because colonialism, in a sense, brought tremendous change to the societies that it interacted with. And hence, did this concept of unquestioning loyalty remain the same in your view? And if so, why?
Well, this is yet another good question worth reflecting upon. It was the same, and yet it was not the same. It was the same because even during the colonial period, though those at the steering wheel were actually the British, that notion was perpetuated. And what it meant was, again, unquestioning loyalty to the sultanates and to other Malay elites and so on. That's the similarity, the historical continuity. But the difference, and this is a very significant difference, is this, that the colonial power, the British, consciously manipulated the sentiment. The reason why they retained the Sultanate, and there were many other reasons, but this was perhaps an important reason, was because they wanted to use it. Don't forget that the British took over the Malay Peninsula, as it were, after the experience in Burma. And what Burma taught them was, that you do not try to eradicate the indigenous political structure. It is better to use it, manipulate it. And so this is what they did. When they came here, they thought that they would be able to use the ruler. And they sustained this particular trait, unquestioning loyalty, because it benefited them in such an obvious manner. Since they were ruling through the Malay rulers, this is how they governed. Their whole system of governance was through the Malay rulers, by ensuring that the Malay populace remained loyal to the rulers. They were actually ensuring that the native population remained totally loyal to British rule. And they were doing something at much lesser cost compared to what had happened in other places, because they did not have to be seen as the direct wielders of power. It was indirect in a sense, and they were using the rulers for that purpose. So I suppose there was unquestioning loyalty to the rulers in the colonial period too, but the substantive beneficiaries were actually the British. I allude, for instance, Khaldun, to the absence of mass organized revolts against colonial rule. Again, it is a complex phenomenon, but it is undoubtedly linked in some ways to this trait, unquestioning loyalty to the ruler, which the British knew how to exploit.
Now, one of the problems with loyalty, I suspect, in the context of Malay political culture, is in part about the nature of that loyalty itself. I mean, most of the older texts that you refer to primarily focus on the relationship between, first and foremost, it's usually focuses on the problems of kingship of the Sultanate itself. But it doesn't speak much about larger society in a sense, aside from using a series of broad brushes to describe them as part of the polity that owes its loyalty to the sultans. Do you think there is a hierarchy of this culture of loyalty, so to speak, which permeates throughout society in some of the periods that you look at? Or was this primarily focused on the kind of the politics of power, so to speak, within a more concentrated zone of the power elite, so to speak?
Well, this is a sort of work which younger academics should be pursuing, meaning by which, that if you look at Malay society, we know for a fact that the rulers did not actually wield real substantive power in many instances. Some of the chieftains were much more powerful than the rulers. The chieftains were much more powerful than the rulers. And there was the structure that they're alluding to of Malay society. So you had other strata, and you had power holders and others who also exercised power. And it would be interesting to see how that is translated into contemporary politics. It's something that I've thought of now and then. If you look at a political party, and then you have the state leadership, the divisions, the branches, and so on. And if you look at the way in which people are rewarded, the way in which people are mobilized and brought into that structure, perhaps there is a precedent. And it is because there is that precedent, it has worked very well. in their politics. In spite of all the problems, it has worked fairly well. It has allowed the people to the top to exercise control, but at the same time, that control is not really concentrated. No modern political leader, for instance, would want to antagonize the divisional chiefs. They would not want to do things which would turn them against their authority. So this may have some precedent in the way in which this society had evolved over a period of time.
Interesting. Thank you, Prof. You know, Prof, you mentioned that in the post-colonial context, especially, after 1957, that as constitutional monarchies, that this whole idea of unquestioning loyalty, as constitutional monarchies, as Muslim rulers, this whole idea of unquestioning loyalty should have been set aside. That this culture would have receded somewhat from the public sphere. But you also state that since independence, it has been assiduously cultivated. What do you mean by that?
Well, if you look at the political party which inherited actual power at the time of independence, or even before independence, that political party, it is not a coincidence, Khaldun was born in the palace. And that is a reflection of the deep relationship between the palace and that political party. UMNO was the inheritor of that phenomenon in Malay society. And so the UMNO leaders, who are the substantive rulers, have consciously cultivated this trait because it serves them. It allows them to exercise power. It allows them to control the community and the larger Malaysian polity. They're able to rule and benefit from what political power brings to elites. And this is what I mean when I say it was assiduously cultivated. In other words, if you did not toe the line, you would be punished, especially if you're within that structure. In other words, there would be a certain degree of tolerance for a political party that's outside that structure. It allow you to operate, for instance. But on the other hand, within the structure, there is obedience, and you expect that sort of total loyalty. And the people who are rewarded, they're not necessarily the best, but they're the ones who are perhaps most forthcoming in the expression of their unquestioning loyalty, which in a sense sometimes creates mediocrity. It strengthens a culture which doesn't help in the growth of society like ours, where you want people to think and reflect, people to create, invent and so on. Because if your dominant concern is with maintaining power at all costs, and you reward people on the basis of loyalty rather than ability, it becomes a bit of a problem. Which is why even a former deputy prime minister, he once remarked that all the prime ministers he had worked with, I won't mention his name, this deputy prime minister, he said that he knew of only one prime minister for whom ability was perhaps more important than just loyalty. While all the others, for them, it was loyalty that counted most. May or may not be true, but this is an illustration of how the phenomenon has expressed itself within that political party, which inherited this phenomenon.
Prof, it's been 4 decades since Protector was first published, and do you think that the views regarding loyalty in the way that you've defined it remains a relevant question today?
It's again a very important question that you raised. It is still a phenomenon. It is still part of our political culture, but it has lost its strength. There's no doubt about it at all. And in Protector, the earlier edition, and also in this present edition, I do emphasize this point, that a lot of things have changed as a result of education, social mobility, the expansion of the middle class in Malaysia, the Malay middle class, which desire for space, which is a phenomenon that has expressed itself in all societies, and very often it would come into some sort of conflict with the feudal elite or a ruling elite that had inherited power in a different circumstance. So all those things have happened in our country. Political competition, electoral politics, just contributed towards the erosion of this phenomenon. The moment you find that these things become more and more pronounced, you find that unquestioning loyalty to a leader becomes less significant. You take UMNO, for instance, look at UMNO in the early years, there was no contest for the top position, except when the Tunku took over from Dato on, there was a sort of contest of sorts. But after that, it was stable from the point of view of the elite, and it went on for quite a long while until Islam and Palestine challenged Hussein on in the late 70s. And after that, we've had the split in UMNO, which is a major change, Team A, Team B, and then what we're witnessing today, the plethora of political parties. That is a reflection of the changes that have taken place. This is why if anyone says, look, let's have total loyalty, total control, complete allegiance, it's not going to happen because the political milieu has changed, and it has changed forever. One has to understand that. So yes, you're right, things have changed, maybe. And I think that change will become even more pronounced in the future. If I reflect on what had happened May 2018, a political party that had emerged with elements from UMNO, just as if you look at other political parties, they're all related to UMNO in one way or another in terms of their, genesis and evolution and all the rest of it. So a political party had emerged. It was at the core of a new power structure of sorts, but it's not really new. But I think it is partly because that political formation somehow did not manifest sufficient appreciation of the dynamics of the society, of that historical evolution and how it had shaped the present, that I think it made some serious mistakes. And today we are witnessing the consequences of those mistakes.
Oh, that's thank you, Prof, for that, for those wonderful answers. In fact, William, we've been prompted with two questions. I think they're very interesting questions as well. Prof, perhaps I can ask them. These are from.
Actually, those are questions from me.
Oh, from you. Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Those were questions that cropped up when the discussion was going on.
Okay, great.
Okay. Perhaps if you don't mind, I think the first one, I think I'll probably start with the first one. So, Prof, this was because you mentioned the British experience in Burma a little bit earlier. And one thing I found very illustrative when I was performing the copy edits to the manuscript were the comparisons between what was happening on the Malay Peninsula versus, for example, what had happened in Sumatra, whereby again there were aristocrats who occupied a relatively similar role. And of course, he also mentioned the example of Japan during the time of the Tokugawa shogunate. But because he had mentioned Burma, then it didn't occur to me until just now. But again, the British would have maintained a similar power structure in colonial India because they would retain the various Maharajas, for example. I'm just curious, and this one's, of course, it's not really related to the main discussion at hand, but was there like a large difference between the British experience in India versus what they eventually employed in the various Malay states?
Well, this requires some reflection.
Mm.
The experience in India, if you read some of the historians, Romila Thapa, or people of that sort, was very mixed actually. They retained the feudal system in some instances, in other instances, they were prepared to take them on, and it had something to do with that particular setting at that particular moment. I don't think there was a sort of overall policy as far as India was concerned, yeah? And I mean, this is why I'm sure you're aware of this, no, William, there's some writer had said that the British Empire in India was created in a fit of absent-mindedness.
Mm. Yes.
That's nonsense. They were very conscious of what they were doing, but I think different responses and all the rest of it, partly because the situation was very complex. Yeah? And one can argue that the Indian experience in some ways was perhaps the one that had the greatest impact upon British colonials in terms of how it shaped their attitudes towards the colonized, yeah, more than their experience in other parts of the world. And so even if you look at their reading of post-colonial societies, and of course the British attempted something which other colonial powers would not have dared to attempt. They set up a commonwealth out of the ex-colonies. And, it is still around, this British Commonwealth, this idea. I mean, this again was conditioned by their experience with various countries, but India played a major role in the formulation of the British Commonwealth. So if you compared the Indian experience with Malay Peninsula, I think the Malay Peninsula was something that was on the margins for the British. It became important in the economic sense after they lost control over India and because of the Korean War. They became very dependent upon rubber. And as you know, Malaya became quite important. They wanted to hold on to Malaya, but there was a communist revolt. So they began to shift, make some changes here and there, not ensure that the interests would be perpetuated. But I don't think our experience at Malay Peninsula was that fundamental to British colonial policy overall compared to the experience in India.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks so much for answering the question. Yeah, I realized it. You definitely did digress quite a bit, but it's very interesting to see again the similarities and dissimilarities across the region. Okay, as you answer the question, it does look like we have received a couple more questions. I can read it out if the both of you don't mind.
No, please do.
Okay. So the first question would be on behalf of Professor Said Farid Alatas.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this question is, when you say the political milieu has been changing, do you feel that it's changing in the direction of the erosion of the feudal mentality in politics?
Undoubtedly, Farid, that is one of the changes that is taking place, that it has been changing. And I don't know whether I mentioned this earlier. I did my thesis under Farid's father, actually, Said Hussein Alatas. I'm most indebted to him for the guidance that he provided as far as my research was concerned, and especially in relation to unquestioning loyalty, because I think he was brave enough and bold enough, made us to raise these questions and begin analyzing. So one hopes that others would continue to look at some of these things, and this is a phenomenon one has to look at, that it is changing. It is changing, it is being eroded, people are fighting back. And I raised an issue in my afterword that you were kind enough to include in the new edition, William. The UMNO-PAS relationship. Because if you look at Islamic political culture, and if you look at the notion of loyalty and unquestioning loyalty and all the rest of it, you have this paradox, as it were, within Muslim societies, as opposed to Islamic values and the Islamic philosophical structure. Within Muslim societies, unquestioning loyalty had been also nurtured and nourished. And it began very early, actually, maybe from the time of Muawiyah. This thing had started to develop. And so when you have PAS teaming up with UMNO in order to maintain, perpetuate Malay power, and they are quite open about this, that this is the whole purpose. And it's something which is related to history, the evolution of our society, and the rest of it. But to what extent would PAS be able to influence in terms of the political culture that is also evolving at the same time? Would PAS, for instance, be able to say, look, what our relationship should mean is greater respect for human dignity and, greater respect for questioning and challenging and, doing things of that sort rather than just unquestioning loyalty to power. Would that change, or would PAS be absorbed into this sort of thing because you want to retain no power? Wouldn't that depend in the ultimate analysis upon the larger milieu? If there are more forces that raise questions about power and the relationship between ruler and ruled, then maybe things will change. It is too early to say how this is going to evolve. But this coming together of UMNO and PAS is important in terms of politics and electoral power, but I think there is a deeper significance to it. The shape and contours, the color of Malay political culture in the future.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. And as it turns out, there's also another question. It's actually a rather lengthy one. So what I can do is I'll try to paraphrase it the best I can. Okay, so this question is from Omnis, and Omnis's question is whether or not the feudalistic mentality ultimately means that introspection and cultural or societal evolution is unlikely. So is there's any and if any evolution is unlikely, then is there anything that has to be sacrificed in order for an evolution of society to take place, such as, for say, the jettisoning of cultural baggage or traditions of dignity? It's a rather loaded question, so I'm not sure how you want to approach it.
Well, I'll try to be brief. It's complex, that question. The relationship between ruler and the so-called feudal culture itself, in the broadest sense, has evolved a great deal. This is something which we have to keep in mind. That if you look at even the sort of structure as such, from feudal rulers, absolute rulers, to constitutional monarchs, it's a major change that had taken place. And from what we know, at least as far as the public domain is concerned, there wasn't any strong resistance from any ruler as such to the changes that were taking place, because the constitution that was formulated first in 48 and then in 57 it demarcated their roles and said, look, these are the boundaries, and you have to observe these boundaries. But they went along. And in many other respects too, they have accepted some of these limitations. But I think the push has to come from the larger society. Let me give a couple of examples very quickly. I think for a constitutional monarchy, there isn't enough financial accountability. In other words, the royal household, expenditure, what purpose, and so on, as it has happened in other constitutional monarchies. These are elements of governance for which there has to be accountability. And one has to move in that direction. We don't even talk about this thing openly because, there is always this feeling that you are doing something very wrong or seditious, or it is something which will create problems and so on. Actually, if you look at the 1971 constitutional amendments, those who had proposed the amendments at that time, people like Razak, others, they made it very clear that one could question, in spite of the amendments, which in a sense entrenched the position of the monarchs. At the same time, it was clear that one could question their behavior. One could question how they conducted themselves, which is why what was done in 1993, the special court and so on, I don't see it as something that is wrong. In fact, the idea of rulers being above the law is not Islamic at all. It is something which we had inherited from the British, right? But this idea that rulers are also accountable, that they should submit themselves to the law, to the notion of governance, ethics of governance, and so on. I think that is something which one should try to develop in this country. And it goes for certain other areas. If constitutional monarchy is to survive and it's to become a positive force in our society, then I think it has to evolve. And it would be wonderful if the push, the drive for that came from among the rulers themselves, especially some of the younger ones who may not be on the throne at the moment, but don't they feel that there is a need for evolution? Don't they feel that there is a need, to sort of develop in such a way that we can evolve into constitutional monarchies where the dignity of the human being is upheld? Social justice becomes a dominant concern. I think that's the only way to go, if you ask me. I hope it will happen.
Okay. Thank you, Prof, for answering the question. At the moment, it looks like there's a bit of a lull in questions from the public. Dr. Khaldun, is there any questions you might want to add, since our conversation has been going into quite a few interesting areas?
Yes, it's moving on all sorts of different directions, which makes it even more interesting in some ways. One of the questions I have, Prof, is talking about political culture since the rise of Malay political, rather than Malay, the rise of different political parties over the past 70 odd years or so, and we're talking about loyalty as in there is almost a kind of cultural normative pressure for people to conform to a certain way of doing things. But how would you explain the rise of so many different political organizations, each vying, so to speak, for the support, as well as trying to encroach upon, the role of the original power elites, the more traditional power elites in Malaysia? Does that not suggest that perhaps, loyalty has become less of a feature of Malay, or perhaps broader Malaysian society over the past half a century or so?
Undoubtedly, loyalty as it expressed itself in the past, that has changed quite a bit. But we are in the sort of situation where it's still not clear how it would evolve. So while loyalty of a certain form has begun to change, we have yet to develop notions of accountability, of transparency, which are rooted in our own milieu. And I think that is very, very important. And I'm sure this is something you would appreciate, Arun, because you've also spoken and written about this. It has to be rooted in one's own milieu for it to succeed. Meaning by which, if you find that in some other society, the evolution of certain notions of ruler-led relationships, it has led to a situation where one is aggressive, confrontational, one uses language which one justifies in the name of democracy and freedom of expression and so on. I do not think we should develop that way. We can, in other words, be polite and restrained as required by the inner situation, and yet committed to certain values and principles. That would be the challenge. It is not happening because, you know, those who may want to do that, there is this fear that you're going to set the apple cart, you know, people would react and so on. There's also the other type of individual who may be inclined to questioning society and so on, but they have so little respect for the sort of norms and values that have been part of this society. It's like the relationship within a family, you know. You want to encourage the individual to think, and you want to see your springs and so on, think and reflect and so on, but you don't want at the same time to develop the type of culture where you have no respect for your parents, no respect for the elders and all the rest of it. That I think is something that we want to avoid. So likewise, I think in the larger political culture, there is a way of engaging. There's a way of discussing these things. It is interesting, now this question has come up in Khaldun, that if you look at the formulation of the Rukun Negara, not many people have asked, why is it that the fifth principle of the five principles is about Kasopanan and Kususila? Is about, you know, the way in which you say things and do things, actually, you know. And it is not something that you would be able to find in the usual sort of political science texts. But, you know, it makes sense within our context because there is a way of articulating one's demands. There is a way of putting across one's feelings, you know, about a certain issue or a certain situation. And somehow we have not succeeded, though it is part of the Rukun Negara, you know, but we have not really succeeded in involving this. And the best demonstration of this would be our parliament. Look at, you know, how utterly chaotic the Malaysian parliament is, and, you know, the words that are used and so on. So this is a challenge. Yeah? But here again, I hope that the intelligentsia and our academics and social activists and so on will be able to play a role. At the moment, a segment of them, they've just been reflecting what is happening in the political arena. And they become sort of appendages to political parties, but that's not what we want to see. We'd like to see them evolve into a force that has a certain notion of ethics, values, principles, yeah, and maintains its integrity, you know, as a force.
So perhaps retaining a certain sense of adab in the way that we, in public discourse, which is probably also, but the feeling I get, Prof, is also the sense that you're also trying to articulate a sense of balance. You know, there's this between these contending things which seem to be pushing in different directions, so that you have a measure of civility in the discourse, yet moving away from the kind of the tendency to want to conform.
Yeah.
And the way, if I understand this correctly, then that seems to me as a very challenging task. how would you propose a way of dealing or rather attending to some of these issues?
I don't think there is a sort of manual which one can put forward when it comes to things like this. It's something that has to evolve, and there must be individuals who are conscious of this and who realize there must be civility, which is a very nice word, and at the same time, you must say certain things because it is speaking truth to power. You know, you have to do those things. You cannot forsake that responsibility, but you must be able to do it in a way in which even those who are your targets, if you like, they would be sort of convinced that they should at least give you a hearing, you know? And we haven't been able to evolve that way. And I think this is one of the things that I regret very much that this is not. There was a time when I was much more involved in Malaysian issue, and this is something that I was actually hoping for. And if I may be allowed to say this, you know, when I was detained under the Internal Security Act in 1987, I managed to get support, and it was not through my own doing because I was in detention at that time, you know, but I managed to get the support of people on both sides of the divide. You look at the three persons who came up with affidavits on my behalf, asking for my release, which had not happened before, and which has not happened since. One was the first Prime Minister, Rahman, from the ruling coalition, and the other person was Tun Hussein, who was our third Prime Minister. And the third person was Dr. Tan Chee Koon, who was leading opposition leader. So it goes to show, I think, you know, that if you conduct yourself in a certain way, you'll be able to draw out these elements. And we've not been able to do that because somehow, as I said a while ago, NGOs become just appendages of political parties, or they use the language and adopt stances which antagonize people. And on the other side, you have those who have become so apologetic as far as, you know, the powers that be are concerned, and they don't want to say anything which would be seen as critical of the powers that be. So this is the sort of situation that we're in. And I think it is a challenge that is present in many other societies. The nature of public discourse, as it were, and whether it is really contributing towards the evolution of our societies. Are we becoming just either, you know, caricatures of other societies, which is what we don't want, or we are sort of just disintegrating, which is also happening.
Thank you, Prof. Sorry, William, I see there's another question. Would you like to?
Yep, this is something I can read out. So I think this may be the last question that we have from the crowd. It's from Alan Ahmad. And the question is about the talks and discussions that have been had in local universities concerning history and the Malay rulers. But why is it that these talks and academic programs, they've never discussed the issues that you've raised in your book? And of course, considering it's been 4 decades, it's a bit of an elephant in the room there.
Maybe Khaldun is in a better position to answer that question. I'm not in academia anymore, and I'd left the academic world, you know, in 2012, in 8 years now. And I suppose young academics like him and others are in a better position to answer this question. But a very quick observation. by and large, I think that dilemma that we talked about just now, it is something which pervades the academic community. Those who are slavish in their support of powers that be, and would regard any form of criticism as a threat to national security, and so on. Yeah. Because I remember when we were trying to revive the Rukun Negara, there was some academic who publicly said that you must be very careful because if you start talking too much about the Rukun Negara, it'll become a security issue. So I think this is the problem, the way in which we look at these things. So you have that breed within the academic community, and then you've got others who somehow feel that if they're worth their salt, if they are good academics, then they must adopt a confrontational position on every issue. It does not matter what the issue is, you must adopt a confrontational position, and you must be seen as speaking the language that is associated with what they see as dissent, when actually it may be a very superficial notion of dissent. So I think that is part of the problem. Why some of these issues are not introduced in our universities. They don't discuss amongst young people.
Perhaps, Prof, is also not helped by the fact that if you look at the chancellors of our local universities are predominantly made up of members of the royal family, of royalties themselves.
Yeah, that could be part of the thing. But the entire power structure, if one may say this, don't you think that in many ways universities over the years, looking at the only university we had in the 60s, right up to the early 70s, if you like, University of Malaya, and its governance, and the type of people who are associated with it, and the position taken by the Students' Union in the 1969 elections, which was an attempt to articulate an independent position. Whether we agree or not is something else, but it was an attempt. It was a serious attempt to sort of say, look, we're taking this position, but we're not a Trojan horse for anyone. But at the same time, we feel that universities, students should play a role. Now, over the years, I'm feeling that universities have become, one hand, appendages of the bureaucracy, as it were. You look at the appointments, senior positions, and the way in which power is exercised within the campus as a reflection of the larger milieu, the way in which power is conceived and administered. And at the same time, you find that dissenting voices, I'm talking of those dissenting voices which may be able to contribute, people who are trying to be balanced, a word that I've been used to while I'm trying to be balanced. You find that they have no role. They are sidelined. And I think this is.
I think just a short addition to that as well. Thank you, Prof. But just a short addition, William, but one of the problems that we do have in universities, in large, is also to do with the nature of the bureaucratic process that we've adopted. We've essentially become bureaucratic institutions. We're no longer academic ones. And that's one of the fundamental problems that we do have. And unless that's addressed effectively, some of the issues that Professor Chandra just mentioned just now will continue to perpetuate itself. But it goes back also to the I think some of the concerns that Prof raised in the book about the nature, about this notion of unquestioning loyalty. Perhaps loyalty has shifted. It's not just about to specific institutions within the state, but the various institutions that exist within the state apparatus itself that elicits this kind of loyalty, so to speak, unquestioning loyalty, because the process rather than the principle or the aims determines the outcome and what is being sought after. So that may be one concern, which is, I think, related closely. And that's the other thing about Prof's book, which perhaps readers out there may want to explore is to think not just in terms of how it relates to the question of unquestioning loyalty in that very narrow sense, but rather broadly speaking, and how it relates to larger society as a whole, in terms of everything ranging from popular culture all the way to the kind of administrative practices that we imbue within our institution. So it's a range of, I think, questions that can be raised by the issues he raised in Protector.
Okay, thank you for that, because it does provide it actually functions as a good coda of sorts to Prof's statement earlier. It does look like we have answered all the questions from the crowd. Are there any perhaps last questions that you might have, Dr. Khaldun?
No. I think we should let Prof. Chandra rest.
Okay. I was thinking that if Prof. Chandra, if you may want to, ponder a bit and have a bit of a reflection. This is also because in light of your long career, because you've basically been around to see the growth of a lot of scholarship and everything, and I mean also because you did study under Professor Syed Hussein Alatas. Do you have any thoughts on the whole evolution of I suppose Malay studies in general? Because you've been around to see the shift from the Orientalist colonial lens, and there's Professor Hussein Alatas as well, and of course there's the evolution to where we are now. Are there any comments that you might have on the state of things, the development, and perhaps the future directions?
Very quickly, William, since you raised this question. More than the absence of enlightened discourse on some of the issues that we talked about, as far as the academic community is concerned, the larger intellectual community, it's such a shame that one of Prof. Syed Hussein's perennial concerns, it has not really impacted upon our society. What is that? It is his concern with the phenomenon of the captive mind. The captive mind.
Yes.
Written about the captive mind, a number of very well thought out articles. So this notion of the captive mind, it impacts upon our society in totality, and it's not just our society. If you look at development policies, you look at the way we respond to crises, whether it is the COVID-19 crisis or other types of crises, the way we think about national unity, the way we think about human rights, human responsibilities. We're not thinking in a manner which shows that we are prepared to get out of the box, rather than just sort of regurgitate what some of us have learned, in certain settings. We just reproduce that sort of thinking. And I think this is, I remember when I was teaching in one of the universities here, one of the questions that a colleague of mine asked his students, the examination question was to evaluate the relevance of religion to society using Max Weber as one's basics. And I have nothing against Max Weber. I think those of us in social sciences, we know what a great thinker he was. But the point one is making is, for a society like Malaysia, the question doesn't even arise. Religion is so much a part of the society. And you have to think about religion in a manner in which it shows that you understand that this is something that is dear to the people. It is something which is important in terms of shaping our future. You can't just discard or sideline, religion. And yet you find that there are people who think that way, which shows that They're just regurgitating what they have learned. Other societies have gone through a certain process, we must go through the same process. In terms like, conservative, modern, and so on, they use all these terms within that particular understanding without looking at their own society. And so I see this as a major challenge, because we're passing this on to another generation, and they in turn would pass it on to another generation. This type of thing. Oh, yeah. One is not being frivolous or flippant about this when you say that, why is it that, even today, as a little child, you would have been exposed to things like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. You find that these things are still there. They're very much there. These are the things which, it's part of the nursery rhymes and stories that, the young kids today are exposed to, and this is going to go on. Can't we think of that type of folklore from our own tradition that we can draw out and which we can present to our people? And we don't do that because there's really no effort behind this. I know a couple of students of mine in the past who tried to do this, but there was no support for them, from the institutions, the established institutions. You're referring to universities, William, earlier on, and even other bodies. There was no support. They were doing this in Bahasa, translating some of the writings that come across and trying to give their own interpretation. So some of these things from China, from India, from Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Persian world, and so on. There were no takers. So I think the problem is still us. It's us. And I don't know how it's going to change, because we are in a sense in a rut. We're caught in this rut. And we don't seem to be able to catch some glimmers of hope here and there that would sort of enthuse us, that would sort of inspire us to bring about change. So individuals will have to go on talking about these things, and maybe within our families and within the people we know, we can try to bring about.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And as it turned out, as you're asking the question, a very final question came in from the crowd. Would you be all right with answering this? I promise this will be the very last one. It's a bit more specific because this actually has to do with your scholarship. But this is a question also from Alang Ahmad. So that'll be the second question. It's whether or not the work Tujuh Wasiat Raja-Raja Melayu fits under your scholarship.
No, I have not looked at this issue, but let me say this, if I may, that when this thing was first raised in the public arena, the thing about the Wasiat Raja-Raja, there were local scholars and archivists who told me that they had very serious doubts about the authenticity of that. And that is something that we must, I think, first establish before we start talking about this as if it is something authentic, something real. Because if you look at the various documents that have been used for analysis in terms of information of the Constitution and, the ideologies of the parties that were dominant at that time, this doesn't appear in those documents. This is something that emerged in the last few years. People started using it, and since some people in authority had spoken about this wasiat, others had just accepted it as the truth. We don't know. I think first, and that's what good scholarship is all about, let's establish that, whether it is there now. Whether there was such a wasiat or not, there are some of the fundamental issues that have challenged politics in our country. Those issues we have to deal with. And put it very, very simply, and I think in a way, Protector is part of that attempt, a very modest, inadequate attempt to look at this larger question. How did this society evolve? What's its history, its background? Why are we where we are? What is the identity of this nation? It is a pity that we have to continue to raise this question, but this remains a major question. And when I look at the divisions in our society, first the major divisions, sort of dichotomies that divide our people along ethnic lines, religious lines, I tell myself that this is something that we have to set under the carpet. There's no reason why we cannot have a group of people, William, in Malaysia, all community, including brothers and sisters in Sabah, who have a shared vision of this nation. We're not talking political parties. We're talking of people outside party politics. A group of individuals, young people preferably, with a shared vision, who understand what the past was, what the present is, and what the future should be. Of course, one can contest these views and so on, but nonetheless, at least a shared vision that does justice to not just to the way in which the political parties look at issues from their own perspectives and so on, a sort of vision that does justice to the innermost feelings of our people, our communities. It's major task. I think we need.
Okay. Thank you so much, Prof, for that. And I think those actually function as perfect closing words for tonight's book launch. So, I suppose to quickly wrap up, it's really been an honor to be able to work on your book, and after so many months to actually have a new edition of it out in the world again. So we thank you for, of course, taking the time to look through it and for the patience that you've had so far with the entire process.
Okay. Let me also thank Grabdaya and you in particular, William, because others wouldn't know about this, but I think you have been just amazing. Your commitment to getting this book out, and if it had not been for your commitment, I don't think the book would have seen the light of day.
Thank you. It's just part of my job, I suppose. Just doing the job. Okay, and Dr. Cowden, thank you for taking the time off your schedule for this very late night session. It's so for the two of you, it's
always a pleasure and an honor, William. Especially when I have to deal with Prof. Chandra's work. It's a challenge more than anything else.
Lovely. Okay.
And just very quickly, Khaldun worked with me in University of Science Malaysia, in our center there, Center for Global Studies. And he is one of the very few young people. I say this from the bottom of my heart. It gives me some hope. It keeps me alive.
Okay. Fantastic. Okay. So
thank you very much, Robert. Embarrassing. Tak adalah. Thank you, Prof. Terima kasih banyak. InsyaAllah.
Okay. So what I'll do is we'll be ending the live stream for our viewers today. So Dr. Cowden, Dr. Chandra, if I may just
thank you, William. Okay. Thank you, Prof. Take care.
Okay. Thank you very much, and everyone have a good night, and we will see you again.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.